Welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert in Washington, D.C. with your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz. Talking two kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now, your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Hello and welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, the Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. And this is our weekly foray into how to live as two kingdom citizens, faithful to God in service to our neighbor. You know, because we need to engage the culture for the sake of the culture and the mission of the church. I know that's a mouthful, but that's what we're in this world to do. We're in the world, not of it, but as believers, we seek to be useful in God's hands for the world. So today we're going to jump into the deep end and deal with an underlying issue that is plaguing our country today. It's the misunderstanding of the two terms equality and equity. And we're not going to get philosophical about this. We're going to get very practical. Why? Because your liberty is at stake and your religious freedom is at stake. And your ability to truly live the life that God wants you to live is at stake. Because whenever equity and government are in the same sentence, your freedoms, your liberties, and your ability to serve others on God's terms is truly in jeopardy. So today, government's role, equality of access, not equity of result. And so we're going to talk about things like enforced equity is the enemy of everyone's freedom. This should matter to people on both sides of the aisle. And then again, what's the government's main role in our life anyway? What is the Bible's view of that? Why is it bad for everyone when the referees play the game? And I think we're going to even talk about today that even our solutions, when we start to get involved in these kind of discussions, I think the church can help de-politicize many of the issues in our society. Right now, everything is political. And by the way, there's one group of people that's making everything political, and we basically are pushing back against that because there's some things that only free people in community can solve with each other. Government coercion will not do that. And so, again, why we need to defend equal access, but not equity of results. So thanks for joining us again today. God bless you, and hope and pray that the stuff that we talk about in these Liberty Alerts is a blessing to you, because you need to learn to put God's two kingdom engagement of the world, his preserving engagement of the world and his saving engagement. You need to learn how to differentiate those two things so that you can be useful in his hands, both in the culture and for the sake of the mission to save others in the name of Jesus. So if you're so moved, again, we exist purely by the benevolence of those who give. And so you can go to our website, lcrlfreedom.org. And there's a button there where you can give online, and we sure are blessed if you do that. Remember, we seek to be your advocating voice in Washington, D.C., and also your educating voice for the sake of your own abundant living in the culture in which we live. So I'm going to be going, I'm traveling this week to Kettering, Ohio. So if those of you who might be close to Emmanuel Lutheran Church, I'll be looking forward to doing a Champions for Liberty weekend there. And if your church would like to schedule, it's filling up fast. There's a lot of stuff going on in the culture, a lot of challenges to the church and the culture. Politically, things have changed from a religious liberty protection administration to one that is much more antagonistic to the public voice of the church in the public square. And so we need to talk about how we can be faithful to God and faithful to our communities in the environment in which we live today. So if you would like to schedule a Champions for Liberty event, again, you can go to our website, lcrlfreedom.org, and the Champions for Liberty page will help you do just that. All right, so today, let's just jump right in. Some of the things that are going on, again, it's hard to even imagine. I just read an article that New York is trying to force nuns to pay for abortions. The new administration now is funding abortions with taxpayer money. I don't understand why we can't just come to at least a compromise in this regard, that if abortion is legal, we shouldn't have to pay for it if it's against our moral fiber and our conscience. And again, when you start to see that there are laws now that are legislating abortion even after the baby's born alive, folks, this is a terrible reflection on the soul of our culture. And again, so some of these things I'm reading now, I'm just thinking, gosh, we're going backwards again. And it's not humane to be people who can abort children at all, but after the third month. And this idea was gruesome at best just a few decades ago, and now it's being cheered in the streets. That should give everybody pause. That's not the kind of people we should be. And if you had noticed, I don't know, in the Biden administration, what's been interesting is, because we heard all throughout the Trump presidency that he was acting monarchical and he was, amassing power. And if you look at what he actually did, he wasn't really doing that. Even his executive orders empowered people. It deregulated things so that average people could do things they couldn't do before. Well, the executive orders of the Biden administration are much more federalizing. They're much more gathering power in one place, that is Washington, D.C. In fact, and we don't have time to talk about this today, but the whole defund the police movement is not a get rid of the police movement. It's to actually federalize the police. And I don't know if you've ever been in other countries, the last thing you want is federales. I mean, the last thing you want is government police. What we have now is police force that has to honor the laws that we ourselves vote, and we demand that the badge determine what laws they enforce and what laws and what things they don't. The police are supposed to be accountable to the citizenry. And what you're hearing more and more now is almost a federalization of that. But that's a whole different view of policing. And that's a kind of policing you don't want, because then it's the whim of the politicos. And then police are kind of sent, they're politicized. And that's the last thing you want of a police force. Yeah, there are bad apples in everything. And of course, if someone does not live up to the demands of the badge, well, there needs to be a recompense for that. But this idea of federalizing it, again, that's something that you're starting to hear, and that's just not a good move if you really want a healthy understanding of limited government, individual freedom in your communities. So again, and then of course blaming police for all the issues we have in our communities. They're really a defensive force at the very end of problems in a neighborhood. They're not at the forefront of those things. That's not what they're called to be. We've talked about that too. If you're going to defund police, you've got to strengthen family. They're inversely related to each other. But when you defund police and federalize them, that's even worse. The pandemic, we've seen some of you talk about the federalization, the masks again now. We're finding out, there was a study that came out in Stanford, and the masks have never ever worked as originally. And I've been on this from the very beginning, because we were very concerned about the government's overreach, especially with regards to the church. And we noticed very early on that, 1 week they'd say one thing, next week it'd be something totally different. And if you recall, We were told that masks didn't do anything very early on by the Surgeon General and even by Fauci himself and some of those folks. And then suddenly, masks were everywhere, and you had to even wear it outside. Well, they just came up with a study. I guess the study's a year old, that outside the masks do nothing because there is no transmission problems outside. Uh, there's no cases where they can determine that it happened by transmission outside. And yet we see people all over the country still walking in fear with masks on outdoors. It's kind of crazy. And then to see that, even athletes who are running or playing tennis who are 60 feet away from each other, they're masking these kids up. This is just lunacy. When you start to look at the science and you start to look at what really is going on. And so, again, from the beginning, we said the church was essential, and that churches and citizens should make their decisions about things like masks, shots, going outdoors, going back to work, back to worship. They should make those choices in freedom, with a spirit of faithfulness to God and love for one's neighbor, and with good information. Our counsel from day one was that the government is an advise and consent organization, not a mandate organization, especially with something where, again, 99% of those who get this virus are going to get over it without cause. So we should be free to take their advice based on evidence, not threat, and make our decisions in freedom as law-abiding citizens, not vice versa. So, again, we're at a point right now where with vaccinations, with the studies that are coming out again that are demonstrating again what the contagiousness of this COVID-19, its morbidity, all of the things that we now know about it, and then herd immunity. We should be moving to some sanity, and it seems like we're still, this is still an insane moment in our culture. So prayers for that. But again, all this discussion about use the science, what I see more and more is the politicization of these things. It made me think of something, be careful when the government starts to count certain things, but not others. Why aren't they counting COVID deaths anymore? You don't even see that count. And now they're counting only infections, and I'm not sure why they're doing that. Is if 99% of the people who get sick get over it, why are we counting infections then? And, again, when you start to think of these things, what's the point? Even with the gun violence discussion, and because this is tearing our culture apart, we count certain deaths, we don't count others. And, again, the notion that black perpetrators are being hunted by police, the data actually shows that police are more apt to shoot white perpetrators, not black. That's the data. That's the data from the government itself. But why are we counting certain things and not other things? Why are we not counting how many police have been killed this last year? Or how about the murdered black teenagers in our major cities? I just saw one study that said, with the new policing laws that are really putting much, much more restrictions on police, it could, I can't remember the time frame, but it could limit possibly as high as 100 deaths. But those reduced policing methodologies will also cause anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 new gun deaths that stronger policing would have prevented. Do you see? If you're going to make decisions on these things, you've got to have all the information. Prevent 100, but now have maybe as much as 6,000 more dead folks on our hands. Something's got to change. And then I also read something, this was in the news, Clarence Thomas was talking about some of the Supreme Court rulings, and again, how we citizens should demand rational answers, that we should be able to look and see the same principles being applied throughout these cases. And one of them he talked about where the Supreme Court, when it was talking about teenagers and abortions, the court ruled that teenagers have the emotional maturity to make such a decision even without parental consent. And of course, teachers can even help them do that without parental consent. But then that same teenager, if he fires a gun and maliciously kills someone, then that logic was turned on its head, and now suddenly that same teenager doesn't have the emotional maturity to know what they did was wrong. Well, which one is it? They can terminate a pregnancy because they're mature enough, but they can't understand that it was wrong to shoot somebody because they're too immature. And that's the kind of stuff, as citizens, we've got to demand better from our judges and, of course, better from our politicians. All right. To our topic today. That was just kind of the stuff that was kind of in the news. Our first thought today is that we should be very concerned about how the coercive powers of the government frame the issues for us, especially if we're Christians. And that's why I think it's really dangerous what's happening. And a lot of these issues about critical race theory and about what good government is and how we're going to solve our problems, there's been a shift in the verbiage. We're hearing more and more discussions not about equality, not about equality of access, not about equality before justice. We're hearing the words equity, which is an equality of outcomes. Now, if you think about that just for a minute, for everyone, no matter how hard they try, no matter what gifts they have, no matter what abilities they have, that everyone will come out with the same. Do you realize how many things have to be controlled for that to happen? And do you want to live in a world where everyone comes out the same? Now, if you've noticed, there's been equity movements in culture for the last over 100 years, because there's this idea that we have now the science, the technology, and the money to make sure that everyone comes out the same. And so there's these secular movements that are promising this kind of equity in everything that we do. Well, look at those places. A lot of countries around the world have tried these things, and what you see is a small group of people have lots and lots and lots of stuff, and then everyone else has basically the same, nothing. And that's happening throughout these experiments, and now it seems that America is trying to see if we can adapt that experiment into our culture. Well, the notion of judging people by their character and demanding that everyone has equal access to the covenant that is America, that's still kind of the theme of the culture in which we live. In fact, there's a book out on this, Race and Covenant. It's edited by Gerald R. McDermott, McDermott. Race and Covenant. It's pretty good, and it talks again about the covenant of the equality of equal protection under the law, the right to live free lives in pursuit of liberty and justice and the pursuit of happiness, these kind of things. These were radical notions when the Constitution was formulated. And that's the covenant that's promised to every citizen. And of course, the whole issue of race and slavery meant that certain citizens were not given access to that covenant. But the Civil War and the repudiation of Jim Crow and those kind of things is an opportunity to recapture that for every citizen. And that's kind of that's the American dream: strong families, good education, opportunity to work, again backed by virtue-based, religious-based, discipline-based education, and a government that held all people to the same rules. That's the dream. And here's the other thing: that's the most the government can do. That's one of the big issues today, is that the government has a role to play in our lives. That's to ensure the same rules for people for instance, for opening the business as other folks, or ensure that all have the same opportunity to education, because education is the number one way out of poverty. Ensure that all have the freedom to pursue life and liberty and in virtue, freedom to worship and teach our children according to Scripture, according to their consciences. That's America, and that still draws people here. And that's the government's role, is to undergird that. When the government tries to do more than that, it actually messes everything up. So the whole concept of equality is equal access, equal protection before the law, and to try to get everyone to the same starting line to make sure that the coercive powers of government don't take sides. Again, we get back to the policing role. We want police to be held to certain standards that all of us agree to. The last thing we want is the police force to be in the hands of a smaller and smaller and smaller group of people, because then it can be politicized and can be used again capriciously against citizens. So again, we want people to be able to live virtuous lives to their fullest, seeking happiness, serving those we love in service to God. And there's this sense of divine providence and human agency and freedom, and that's the framework of equal access. Now, government coerced equity is the exact opposite of that. It is interesting. We've got a phrase we use here. Good government cannot save us. Bad government can destroy us. And what that means is that even if government does everything really, really well, it's not the solution. That's the big problem today. People are looking to the government to solve problems it cannot solve. The government's a coercive agent in our lives. The benevolencing agencies are places like the church. They're places like free people in love and service to their neighbor, uncoerced. And so by definition, the government doesn't do that very well. In fact, it messes it up when it tries. Equal access seeks to give everyone a fair start, but then ability, tenacity, effort, wisdom, and the challenges of life determine our path this side of heaven. So, when you start to apply biblical wisdom to some of these things, and remember, ask the right questions of the Bible here. It's not a WWJD type of question. It's a WWFD. What would the Father have us do to preserve the world so that we can hear of the grace of God in Jesus Christ? That's why Paul talks about the fact that there are different gifts. God the Father gives different gifts to people. And so that's one of the reasons why we have a do not steal and do not covet commandment, because people are going to have different things and there's going to be different outcomes in free societies. And the goal is for everyone to try to use what they have from God in service to each other freely, not coerced, but freely. There's a reason why we are not called, to not bear false witness. We're not to try to undermine who our neighbor is, because they have unique gifts from God. And they've given unique efforts in the work that they do. Now, everything that I've talked about up till now, kind of just ad hoc, that's not the real issue for today, though. I don't know what your feelings are about equality of access versus equity of outcome. But the main question today is, what's the government's role in that discussion? What do you think about, it's not so much what do you think about equality and equity, it's what's the government's role in protecting one versus the other. So don't make this personal. I hear all the time people say, well, I think that everyone should get a trophy at the end of the athletic contest. Well, if that's the case, if you think that, well, you can form your own league. You can raise your children the way you want to. In fact, we teach that people should have vocational respect, seeking the truth. But and so while I might disagree with that, I might think you're going to miss out on the unique talents that your children might have. You might miss out on the unique incentive that competition actually brings, so that people can strive to be the very best they can be. But you're free to disagree and make those opportunities for your children and for your family on your own terms. But that's not what's happening today. What's happening is the government's getting involved in these kind of discussions, and they're trying to equalize the outcome by legislation. And so suddenly things like talent, effort, perseverance, drive, compassion, they don't exist. They don't change the outcome, because the government is actually formulating those outcomes in what they're demanding of people. I wrote an op-ed, or not an op-ed piece, but a mom and pop paper on this, and I said it as simply as I can. It's wrong when the referees play the game. So the Christian worldview is not that we think the government is illegitimate. We acknowledge that it has a role to play in our lives to keep the peace, to keep things fair, to ensure equal access for everyone in our culture to the things that make for a good start towards living a good, happy life and making that possible. But the work of doing all that still belongs to the individual person seeking life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what we're saying is, the government in one sense then is the referee, but it's wrong when the referee starts playing the game. It eliminates both our agency and our accountability for our own life, and that's never good for our humanity. People have talked about that as the soft bigotry of low expectations. It eliminates the dignity of our being the protector and provider of our own families. It destroys hope because no matter what your effort, no matter your skill, no matter your ingenuity, all things will wind up being the same for you as for others. So right off the bat, the question for today, especially when it comes to this left-hand kingdom political engagement, and that's what we're talking about today, is that's not the government's role to ensure equity of outcome. In fact, if you look in Romans 13, the government's main role is law and order. It's it's keep things fair to the best of the government's ability. They're to be referees. And that's one of the reasons why when you talk about the institutions, the essential institutions of a society, family, church, and government, but government is the least important of a healthy society. That's why even if the government's doing its job, like we said, we still have to live, work, love, laugh, serve, care for our families, our church, our community, and that needs to be done without coercion or without fear. And the government's coercive role is to prevent us from doing the worst things that we shouldn't be doing. It's not to coerce us to do the best things that we're to be about. So when a government starts to actually play the game of your life, that is never a good thing. That's an out-of-control government. That's no longer a life to be lived. It's a mere existence. That's one of the traps that we see in the welfare state. It just becomes an existence because your life really isn't your own anymore. And if it's not your own, then it can't be lived for the sake of others either. I hear like there's talk about government paying your income without you working, and that's happening more and more with the benefits now that are being paid to people that are out of work. When I was in Chicago, I could not get a cab, an Uber, or a Lyft. And when I finally got one, I paid an exorbitant price to merely go a few miles. And I finally asked the guy, I said, "What's up?" And he said, "There's nobody out here working. They're scared of COVID." That was the first thing. But they're also, it's pretty tough. Many were just making, what they're being now paid in unemployment, so they're not coming back to work. Well, 1 Thessalonians says this: if a person won't work, neither should they eat. Paul says you need to earn your living. He warns against idleness and busybodies because it's never good for sinful people to have no accountability to anyone or anything. The second thing, and this is the one that I dealt with a lot when I was a pastor in New York City, government benevolencing the poor indiscriminately by taking coercively from others and giving it uncritically to people that were in need. Well, again, the issue always on the street was, there are some people that were on the street by their choice, and there are other people on the street because of circumstances beyond their control. If you didn't differentiate those two things, you actually empowered the worst in our human tendencies. You didn't actually solve the problem at all. And the Bible's view of benevolence is actually not to have this coercive agent be the ultimate benevolencer. It's the Bible's view of benevolence is for you and me to freely be agents of benevolence to those in need in our communities. So God gives to you so that you can give freely to others. In fact, even the notion of work is so that you can work so that you have something to give. So for a person to just be a taker and not have the capacity to work when they actually have that capacity, you're dehumanizing them according to the scripture. So the Bible, when it talks about even compassion and benevolence, it doesn't root it in the government. It roots it in free citizens acting freely in service to those they love and care about. If you want to know the difference between a benevolencing organization and a coercive one, the coercive one, when it takes your money, it demands it of you and takes it from you and punishes you when you don't give it, and then it redistributes it to people that you really have no control over. A free organization petitions your resources and then gives it in a way that honors your efforts and your view and your conscience. And if you don't believe me, tax day is coming up. You'll see the difference between tax day and the offerings that are taken at your church. I'm not encouraging you not to give offerings at church, but you'll understand that you're giving freely at church, whereas you're giving coercively on May 15th. But again, some Bible verses. Acts chapter 20, Paul talks again about work and about striving to live lives that honor work and also serve the neighborhood. He said, I coveted no one's silver. This is Acts 20:33, or apparel. You know that we took care of ourselves. And in all things I showed you that working hard in this way, we must help the weak and remember the words of Jesus, it's more blessed to give than receive. But that whole giving notion is built on working. And the most important thing is to learn how to work so that you can give and to make sure everyone has that chance. And then Ephesians says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor. Let him work, honest work with his own hands so that he might have something to give. So again, that's the biblical view of this, and to actually delegate that to a coercive agency called the government, who then indiscriminately gives without really assessing some of these kind of moral prerogatives, is just not a healthy thing for anybody, and it's not going to solve the problem. Good government can't solve these problems, but bad government can destroy. And then the final thing is, we just look at Matthew chapter 22, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. Again, the question is, what's Caesar's stuff? If we're going to give to Caesar, well, what's the Bible say is Caesar's stuff? And generally speaking, Caesar's stuff is law and order and making sure that the rules are fair for everyone. It's God's realm, especially the realm of God's church, where we see things like kindness, benevolence, mercy, forgiveness, and let your efforts be focused there for the sake of your compassion, for the sake of community, and those kind of things. So, again, good government can't save us. The best it can do is get us all to the same starting line and make sure that the rules of society are applied equally. So, equal access to things like education, incentivizing families to stay together so kids can get a real shot at life. These are things that government can do well. That's why one of the reasons why we support things like parental choice or choice in education, because that again gives equal access, equal opportunity. Equity, assuring the same outcome, is always an abuse of power in the hands of few. It's going to defy human nature. It's going to defy the reality that God gives different gifts and abilities. It's going to defy the reality that hard work, perseverance, and desire to serve neighbor actually creates better outcomes for all. It's going to defy the freedom to choose how we live for God and others. And then where that freedom is lost because of the coercive power of government, security is lost as well. And then it's going to define the divine plan of work, benevolence, and community, which is all meant to be done freely. I love what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 9. He said, each one must give as he has decided in his heart. And then it says, not reluctantly and not under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. The notion of coerced equity of outcomes is antithetical to all that. I read a couple of articles in closing that reiterated this. One was, it was a story that's coming from academia, and let me see who the professor is here. Professor John Stodden, he's the James Duke Professor of Psychology and Biology at Duke University. And he was talking about grades and grading students today. And again, the whole notion of actually giving different grades to different people is now somehow controversial. And he said it's built on three fallacies: the belief that all are equally talented, which is not true; the hegemony of feelings, where bad feelings must always be avoided, and that's actually bad advice. And then he says the bad science, which says that aversive control is ineffective, like punishment never helps. And that too is also bad science, he said. He said exam grades conflict with all these assumptions. Students cannot all get the same grade on a rigorous exam because they're not all equally capable of that. A bad grade can hurt, he says. A bad grade can actually motivate the student to work harder. And so even in academia, and this is a secular article, it has nothing to do, again, with the Christian worldview, but the Christian worldview in the left-hand kingdom is a worldview that's rooted in nature and rooted in the moral aspects of conscience, which even secular people often share. And so you see it even in that research. And then the last one was one where it's the story where the professor says everybody gets the same grade, and over time, the incentive to work harder is diminished. When everyone winds up getting the same grade, it starts to diminish their effort all the way around. And of course, everyone does the least amount of work, not the most amount of work, because there's no incentive otherwise to do so. I know that story sometimes. I think Snopes kind of tries to debunk it because it's negative against socialism or communism. But whatever you want to call it, equity of outcome by government coercion, that's really what socialism and communism is. And it defies human nature, and that's one of the reasons why it never works. And so that maybe we still have to have something motivating us more than just economics. Obviously, there's got to be something in our heart that says even work is not just so I can have a lot of stuff, but work is to glorify God and to serve neighbor and to love those that God brings into my life. I agree with that. But having kind of this secular coercive notion of the equity of outcomes, it militates against that as well. So, the issue, again, we're going to start to unpack these things when it comes to things like critical race theory, and because it's all about equity of outcomes, as if sinful people with government power can actually do that. So today, just to keep it simple, the issue in God's preserving work through things like government is not what you think of equality of access or equity of outcome, but what's the government's coercive role in those issues. And their role is not equity of outcome. It's to keep things fair, incentivize family structures to stay together for the sake of the children, equal access to quality education, equal justice under the law, equal protection under the law, same laws for everyone, coercive power of government under the authority of the citizens, not under some federal force, that kind of thing. Because good government can do those things. It cannot save us. It cannot solve the big issues of life. That is left to free citizens living free, virtuous, religiously motivated lives, working hard so that they have something to give. So, law and order, equal access, yes, in a free society. That's the government's role. Equity of outcome through coercive power, no. That's not good in a free society, and the Bible doesn't support that as well. And so, again, when it comes right down to it, when politics kind of takes over everything, when it teaches us what is desirable, what is lawful, what is effective, and then even guarantees all outcomes in the hands of sinners, such brutal efficiency always ends in tyranny. And my last thought on this is that this is where the church, if we do our job, we can start to de-politicize some of these issues. We can say it's not the federal government's role to do this or to decide that. It's the role of free citizens in community, acting by virtue of their conscience in service to their neighbor. That's where these issues are going to change. And so one of the best ways we can get involved in politics is to start to depoliticize some of the issues and push back on some of the government's intrusion into these areas for the good of all people. Not just for the good of the people of the church, but for the good of all people. So again, thanks, for the emails. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for being a part of our work together. And I hope and pray that this Liberty Alert gives you a sense of what we're talking about. Don't let the conversation be changed from equality of access or equality in general to equity of outcome. That's going to be a destructive move for everyone in our society. And we as a church have a responsibility to push back on that, because we know the answers to the big questions of life are not going to come from the equity efforts of the coercive government, but from free citizens acting in service to their neighbor in community. So till we see Jesus face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, God richly bless you. I'm Greg Seltz. Have a great day.